Hey guys, tonight we're headed back to a time before earbuds, before white noise machines, before you could drown out the world with a tap of your finger. You're standing under the wide blue hush of an attic sky. The air is thick with pine resin, sun-warmed dust, and the electric buzz of cicadas, so loud and constant that the very idea of silence seems like a cosmic joke. But the Greeks knew better. They didn't just know silence. They named it, categorized it, weaponized it, and worshipped it. They gave it shades and tones, like an artist with a palette of muteness. To them, there wasn't just one silence. There were many. Sige, the sacred quiet of temples. Syope, the neutral hush of absence. Hesychia, the internal stillness of a peaceful mind. Silence wasn't what happened when sound went away. It was what happened when something deeper took its place. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your slow wander through a grove just outside ancient Athens. It's early evening, and the shadows are stretching long across the rocky soil. Olive trees twist up like arthritic fingers. Between their trunks, men recline on stone benches, heads bent together in murmured conversation. The city is near, but for a moment, all you hear is cicadas and the soft swish of sandals in dust. This isn't silence, not really. But to the Greeks, it was a kind of quiet, a public quiet, a social quiet, a hush that invited dialogue without demanding noise, the kind of space where ideas could breathe. The famous Roman orator Cicero once said that the Greeks had a word for everything. He wasn't wrong. In fact, when he studied rhetoric, he marveled not only at how the Greeks spoke, but also at how they didn't. Silence, in their view, was part of the language. A pause could be more persuasive than a paragraph. Historians still argue whether this linguistic richness came from spiritual tradition, from political life, or from something even older, some primal Mediterranean awe of nature's bigness. But they all agree on one thing. The Greeks weren't afraid of quiet. They revered it. Sometimes they even feared it. You take a seat beside a small spring, the water gurgling softly over smooth stones. Someone, probably a local poet, has scratched a few lines of verse into the rock. I listened long beneath no sound, and there I heard the world. It's not famous, it's not even particularly good, but it's honest. It speaks to that ancient tension between presence and absence. The Greeks didn't just think of silence as emptiness. For them, silence was a fullness, of potential, of gods, of meaning not yet born into words. Now, back to those cicadas. You'd think the ancient Greeks might have found the non-stop buzz annoying, and some of them did. But others saw it differently. In fact, there's a weird, delightful little tidbit from the playwright Aristophanes, who joked that politicians were like cicadas, loud, persistent, and totally useless unless they shut up. There's even a myth that says cicadas were once human musicians who loved singing so much they forgot to eat, and turned into insects as a reward for their devotion to sound. The irony? These creatures became the eternal background to Greek ideas of quiet. You stand again and keep walking. Around you, the sounds shift. A low bleating of goats, the wooden clack of a lyre from somewhere unseen. You pass a young boy reciting lines from Homer. His voice is steady, but every few words, he pauses. Not because he's forgotten, but because the pauses matter. In Greek epic poetry, those breaks weren't accidents. They gave space for breath, for meaning, for gravity, like a drum beat made of silence. And here's a strange little historical fact. In some Athenian schools, students were graded not just on how well they spoke, but how well they paused. Too rushed? You missed the point. Too long? You looked uncertain. But just the right silence? You commanded the room. Even now you find yourself walking more softly. Maybe it's the effect of the landscape, or maybe it's something older, some memory your bones haven't forgotten. The idea that speech is power, but silence, when used well, is authority. In the distance, the Acropolis gleams pink with twilight. But you don't head toward it yet. Instead, you follow a footpath that veers away from the city walls. You pass a hermit's hut, nothing but stone and straw and a fig tree out front. No one speaks. A pair of eyes blink slowly at you from the shade. You nod and continue. There's something deeply human about this moment. You, the visitor, the hush around you, the unspoken agreement between strangers to let the silence speak first. And as the sky deepens into navy, you wonder, not for the first time, whether modern life has too few words for quiet. We've got mute. We've got silent mode, maybe awkward pause. But the Greeks, they had a full spectrum. Words to describe the silence of peace, the silence of terror, the silence of wisdom, the silence of shame. We might have lost some of those nuances, but tonight we'll try to find them again, one quiet footstep at a time. You're still in motion, walking a worn dirt path toward the outskirts of Athens. The city's noise is behind you now, a faint echo of marketplace bartering and bronze striking bronze. Ahead, the world narrows. Thickets of laurel and wild thyme brush against your arms. A breeze sighs through the dry leaves, carrying with it a scent of earth and something else. Anticipation. Like the quiet just before a confession. You come upon a simple marble stele by the road, half buried by time. Its inscription is mostly worn away, but one word remains perfectly clear. Hesychia, inner stillness. Not just silence around you, but silence within you. The Greeks had at least half a dozen terms for silence, each with its own flavor. There was sige, the kind of silence you keep when secrets are at stake. It's the tense hush before a verdict, or the knowing glance that says, "Don't speak here." Then there's siope, a more neutral, passive kind of quiet, the absence of sound, often used in poetry to describe empty landscapes or abandoned rooms. And then there's hesychia, issachia, the good silence, the peace and quiet silence, the kind of stillness sought by philosophers, poets, and exasperated parents. It's the word monks would later clutch like a candle in the dark, centuries after the fall of Athens. A silence of order, of alignment. It's almost funny. Modern languages tend to treat silence like a flat note. Either you're talking or you're not. But ancient Greek treated silence like a scale, a gradation of mood, context, intent. Historians still argue whether these linguistic distinctions were widely understood by common folk or were the invention of elites, philosophers, temple scribes, speech coaches. There's little surviving evidence from the peasant classes after all. But based on the saturation of these words in Greek literature, drama, and philosophy, it's clear they weren't obscure. People didn't just live with silence, they practiced it. You kneel beside a dry stream bed, listening. There's no water, but the wind is performing a slow sonata over stone. You close your eyes. This, you think, might be eremos silence, the silence of the deserted, the forsaken, a poetic stillness full of longing. And right then, your foot brushes against something half buried in the dust, a shard of painted pottery, just a scrap, a curve of black glaze on ochre clay. Maybe it was once part of a vase. Maybe it told a story. Now it is mute. Still, even broken things can whisper if you're quiet enough. You recall a line from Pindar, the lyric poet. Silence is the flower of understanding. He didn't mean ignorance. He meant that true comprehension often grows in wordless soil, in pauses, in listening. Which is a bit ironic coming from a man who made his living with words. But that's the paradox of the Greeks. They were obsessive speakers, lovers of debate and dialogue. Yet they also believed deeply in the value of holding back, of pausing, of letting a thought ripen in silence before giving it form. You walk on, and the terrain flattens. Ahead lies an abandoned gymnasium, just a few columns standing like old teeth in the earth. You slip through what used to be a portico and step into what might have once been a training field. But no one runs here now. Only the low hum of bees in clover and the creak of cicadas from distant trees. There's a strange peace here. Not absence, exactly, but a harmony of presences not needing to speak. It feels deliberate, like a painting composed of stillness. And then you remember something funny. The playwright Menander once complained that audiences were too noisy, laughing at the wrong jokes, coughing through the good lines. He fantasized about a crowd that would respond only with silence. Today, that would be a nightmare for a performer. But to Menander, silence wasn't emptiness. It was appreciation. Of course, not all silence was so lofty. Sometimes it was just awkward. Like when Alcibiades, the infamous party boy of Athens, tried to give a stirring speech and accidentally belched in the middle of a solemn silence. The audience reportedly stayed stone quiet for a full minute, which, to a Greek politician, was far worse than booze. It was the silence of social death. The Greeks used silence as a social tool. In court, a calculated pause could twist the dagger. In romance, a glance and a well-timed breath could mean more than a love poem. Silence could invite or reject, welcome or shame. As you turn to leave the crumbling gymnasium, a sudden gust lifts dust into the air. You shield your eyes, and when you look up again, You spot a figure in the distance. A child, standing motionless in the golden light, staring at you. She raises one finger to her lips. You blink, and she's gone. Was she real? Was she memory? Or just the voice of the land reminding you? Listen. The sun is beginning to set, burning low over the horizon. You head west, toward a grove known for its springs. Your steps are quiet now, more deliberate. You start to realize you're not just learning about Greek silence. You're starting to feel it in your bones, in the space between thoughts. And somewhere, on the edge of your awareness, you understand this much. Silence is not the opposite of sound. It is its partner, its frame. The Greeks knew this. They painted with words, yes, but they outlined in quiet. Your path now winds uphill, the sun lowering behind you, casting everything ahead in a warm amber glow. The air has that dreamy thickness that comes just before nightfall. When the wind dies down, animals nestle into their hiding places, and the whole landscape seems to draw one long collective breath. You step carefully on uneven stone steps, worn smooth by centuries of sandals, bare feet, and ritual processions. Up ahead, you catch sight of it. A temple. Modest by Greek standards, not one of the marble giants, but still proud and precise. Dorian columns rise cleanly from a platform choked with weeds, and beyond the colonnade, shadows gather in a sanctuary that once belonged to Hestia, goddess of the hearth and the center of every sacred space. As you pass between the columns, everything changes. The sound of your own breathing becomes loud. Every footstep echoes off stone walls. Even the rustle of your tunic seems offensive. This is Sige, the sacred silence, the one imposed by custom, by fear, by awe. Ancient Greeks believed certain spaces weren't just quiet, they demanded it. In temples, you didn't speak unless you had to. You entered as a visitor to something larger than yourself. The gods didn't want idle chatter. They wanted attention. They wanted reverence. They wanted the air around them free of mortal noise. Historians still debate the origins of this tradition. Some argue it came from Minoan practices of hush during religious rites. Others say it arose organically, because the acoustics of ancient temples made even whispers seem like shouts. Whatever the case, the rule was clear. Silence was a form of devotion. You imagine standing there with a group of initiates. Maybe you've just walked 10 miles barefoot in the heat to reach this place. Your teacher gives you a look. No words. Just a hand placed flat over the heart. A signal. No talking now. This is Sige time. A crow caws somewhere behind the hills. You flinch. Even nature seems to know it's being a little rude. In some rituals, silence was enforced for hours, even days. The Eleusinian mysteries, perhaps the most famous of the Greek religious rites, had strict prohibitions against speaking, not just during the ceremonies, but afterward. Initiates weren't even allowed to describe what happened, under penalty of death. The silence itself became a kind of boundary, wrapping the sacred in an armor of mystery. It gets weirder. Some temples didn't even allow you to enter if you had spoken certain words earlier that day. One inscription found near a healing shrine says, "Let no one enter who has cursed, or gossiped, or spoken of commerce." You could almost imagine a priest at the door holding up a hand. "Sorry, buddy. Come back when your mouth's been holier." And speaking of holy, let's talk about silence as an offering. Yep, just as you'd sacrifice a goat or pour wine on the ground, the Greeks believed silence itself could be a gift to the gods. In one story, a poor farmer has nothing to offer at a festival, so he sits at the edge of the crowd and remains completely silent for the entire day. At night, a priest has a dream. The god was pleased by the man who made space for my voice. You walk slowly around the inner chamber of the temple. There's no roof anymore, just the open sky. The altar is long gone, but the stone grooves in the floor remain, like scars in the earth. You touch one, and your fingers come away chalky. Dust of the ages, ash of prayers. And right then, you remember a curious tidbit. Ancient Greek oracles, the mouthpieces of the gods, often began their prophecies with silence. Long, heavy, intentional silence, sometimes punctuated by a sharp breath or the rustling of leaves or the twitch of a torch flame. The waiting was the message. It built tension. It cleared the mental stage. Modern theater directors would call it the pregnant pause. Ancient Greeks just called it holy. You sit for a moment at the edge of the threshold. The sun is almost gone now, and the first stars are twinkling overhead. You look up and think about how many people have stood in this exact spot. How many thousands of sandals, calloused feet, ritual dances, tears, and prayers have moved through this space, all wrapped in the same deep hush. Suddenly, your thoughts drift to a comedy by Aristophanes. Yes, even comedies took silence seriously. In The Wasps, there's a moment when a character is asked to swear an oath, and instead of responding, he just stays silent. The silence, in that context, is the answer, and the joke. Audiences laughed, but they also understood. Silence spoke volumes. You rise and take one last look at the temple. The moon is rising now, pale and full, throwing long shadows between the columns. You step out into the cool night air, leaving behind the echoing hush of sacred stone. But you carry something with you. Not a voice, not a line, just the weight of quiet. A soft, solid kind of stillness, one that doesn't ask you to fill it. You're back on the road now, descending gently from the temple's hilltop. Night has folded itself around the landscape, soft and weightless. A crescent moon hangs low, lighting the path just enough to keep you from stumbling. Your footsteps are quieter than ever, as though the hush of sacred silence still clings to your skin. And perhaps it does. But then, off in the distance, you hear something different. A drum beat, slow and steady. Not music. A signal. You pause, ears straining. A second beat. A third. Then, nothing. You've stumbled onto the edge of an old battlefield. Of course, there's no fighting now. Just cracked helmets half buried in weeds and shards of broken spear shafts. But once, this space was thunder. War cries, screams, bronze on bone, and, perhaps most unsettling of all, long, terrifying silences. The ancient Greeks didn't just believe in silence for temples. They believed in it for war. before the charge, before the first clashing of phalanx lines. There was always a hush, not a peaceful one. This was Tromos, the trembling silence, the one that crawled up your spine and made your stomach lurch, the one that told you, this is the last quiet you might ever hear. Historians still argue whether Greek soldiers maintained complete silence as a tactical choice, or if it was more cultural, an instinctual reaction passed down through generations. There are accounts from Persian observers during the Greco-Persian Wars describing the eerie quiet of Greek formations as they waited to engage. No shouting, no rallying cries, just the rhythmic beat of feet and the slow, controlled exhale of warriors facing the abyss. You kneel beside a toppled stone slab, perhaps once a grave marker. The name is long worn away, but a single phrase survives beneath a chipped laurel wreath. Ansige Nike. In silence, victory. You almost expect a ghost to whisper something back. One mainstream fact about Greek warfare: the phalanx formation was built on unity and discipline. Rows of hoplites stood shield to shield, spears pointed forward, moving as one wall of death. And this unity? It required silence. One soldier shouting could break rhythm. One scream could start a panic. So silence wasn't just respectful, it was strategic. It kept the line. But even in this, there were quirks. A lesser-known practice in Sparta. Some units were trained to march without sandals, to minimize noise. The idea was to descend upon enemies, not with a roar, but like a creeping nightmare. That moment when you realize something is behind you, not because you heard it, but because the world went suddenly too quiet. You begin to walk again, stepping carefully through grass and scattered stone. Your thoughts turn to the tension between bravery and silence. You always think of heroes as loud, Achilles roaring on the field, Ajax calling for blood. But the most dangerous warriors were the ones who said nothing, who let their silence build dread. And then there were the silences after battle, the field strewn with limbs, armor, torn standards, no bird song, no wind, just the settling of dust and grief. In tragedy plays, this moment was sacred, the hush after the horror. Poets called it the mouth of the underworld yawning. That's the kind of metaphor that makes you want to never sleep again. But you're here for the sleepy history, so let's tone that down a bit. Let's remember instead the quiet burials. In Athens, fallen soldiers were honored with speeches, but their final moments, when their bodies were carried through the city, were observed in silence. No wailing, no applause, just solemn footsteps and the creak of funeral carts. That silence was not just respect, it was resistance, a refusal to glorify death with noise. You reach a gentle rise at the edge of the battlefield, and there's a small stone bench, part of a long-forgotten war memorial. You sit. There's a cool breeze now. Somewhere far off, a dog barks once, then stops. The land settles again, and you can't help but wonder how much of human courage has lived not in shouts, but in silences. You remember that Aeschylus, yes, that Aeschylus, the father of Greek tragedy, was once a soldier. He fought at Marathon, and in his epitaph, He didn't mention a single one of his many plays. Just this, that he fought bravely and in silence for his city. There's a strange kind of beauty in that, like a poem that never had to be written down. A fringe theory you might enjoy. Some scholars speculate that specific hand signals used by hoplites during battle evolved into gestures used in silent religious rites later on. That the gestures of war became the gestures of peace. There's no hard proof, of course, but it's the kind of theory that lingers, like the scent of metal in the air after lightning. The stars above you twinkle sharper now. The battlefield, for all its ghosts, feels still, not haunted, just remembered. And as you rise to leave, your foot nudges a curled, dry laurel leaf. It crumbles with the softest crackle. A reminder. Even silence makes a sound, if you know how to hear it. You leave the battlefield behind, your path curling downhill toward a grove where the trees thin and the land opens into a natural amphitheater. Even in darkness, its shape is unmistakable. Concentric rows carved into the hillside like the ribs of some slumbering giant. You approach slowly, as though entering someone's dream. This was a place for stories, for drama, for gods and mortals to swap masks and dance their shared madness under the stars. But tonight, it's empty. No chorus, no torches. Just the creak of crickets and the distant sigh of wind across stone. You take a seat near the back row, letting your fingers brush the worn marble. Even after centuries of sun and rain, the seat holds the memory of 1,000 backs. Here, silence wasn't absence. It was tension. It was the moment before tragedy struck or punchlines landed. Greek theater knew how to use silence like a scalpel. Take this mainstream fact. In plays by Euripides and Sophocles, actors often paused for full beats before speaking. Entire plot turns hinged on what wasn't said. A king turning away instead of answering. A daughter, mouth open but voice caught in grief. The audience knew these silences. They felt them. In many cases, they feared them more than speeches. Historians still argue whether audiences sat in total quiet during performances or murmured and reacted like modern viewers. Some say the cultural reverence for theater meant that audiences were near silent, except during comedic plays, where laughter was encouraged. Others suggest they whispered, shifted, gossiped. But there's no doubt the theater played with silence deliberately, not just as a break from noise, but as a character in its own right. You imagine a performance underway. A hush falls over the crowd, not because they're bored, but because something terrible is about to happen. The character has a knife, or a truth, or both. And they pause. 1 heartbeat. 2. That pause is everything. You remember the word syope, the observational silence, the type used in theater to show the audience that something had changed. Not quite reverent, not quite fearful, just alert, eyes wide, breath held. In Oedipus Rex, there's a moment when the truth is hovering in the air. Everyone knows it, but no one says it. Sophocles lets the silence stretch, like a rope being pulled tight. And when it snaps, so does Oedipus's life. Silence, then, was the Greek equivalent of cinematic slow motion. But theater also used comic silences, moments when characters stood awkwardly, unsure of what to say, or when they were stunned into speechlessness by absurdity. Aristophanes, for example, often used silent characters as comedic tools. In Lysistrata, a Spartan ambassador stands mute while others mock his city's obsession with war. He doesn't need lines. His silence says, "I surrender." And of course, there's the audience's silence, what we might call respectful quiet today. But in ancient times, it was more participatory. The Greeks saw listening as an act of civic duty. Being quiet during a play wasn't passive. It was engaged. You watched. You absorbed. You waited. And in your silence, you judged. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, about a performance of Antigone in which the audience remained so still during a critical monologue that the birds stopped singing. Was that real? Probably not. But it tells you what the Greeks believed about silence. It could radiate outward. It could change the world around it. You rise now, descending the stone steps toward the stage. The skein is long gone, but you can see where it once stood. A backdrop of painted wood, columns, and drapery. You step onto the orchestra, the round dancing floor at the center of the theater. Your shadow, cast by the moon, stands alone in the circle. You try something. You say nothing. And in that not saying, you imagine the hush of 5,000 citizens leaning forward, waiting for you to break. There's a fringe tidbit here. Some actors were trained to deliver entire scenes in mime. Not pantomime as we think of it now, but controlled, wordless expression. It was a skill praised by Aristotle, who believed that gesture could sometimes surpass dialogue in emotional weight. Silence, when paired with movement, became a language of its own. You think again of modern cinema, of how many moments are ruined by over-explaining. But here, in this ancient theater, silence was an invitation. A blank space the audience filled with their own dread, or joy, or suspicion. You cross to the edge of the orchestra and sit on the lip of the stage. The silence here is rich, alive. It vibrates almost, as though waiting for someone to say something wrong. And maybe that's the last unspoken rule of Greek theater. If you're going to break the silence, it had better be worth it. You leave the theater behind, stepping lightly down a narrow path lined with sleeping fig trees. The moon has climbed higher, casting silver pools between patches of shadow. Somewhere in the brush, a night bird calls out once. Then nothing. Just the crunch of gravel under your feet and your own breathing, steady and soft. Ahead, a faint glow flickers from a courtyard lantern. You drift toward it, past ivy-covered walls and the hushed rustle of an olive press left idle for the night. You're entering a small Athenian home, not rich, but comfortable. Inside the courtyard, 3 men are seated cross-legged around a low table. One of them gestures toward you without looking up. He doesn't say anything. He just taps the seat beside him. A quiet invitation. You sit. This is not a party. This is not a sermon. This is a symposium. A gathering not of drunken revelers, well, not always, but of thinkers, philosophers, students, the kind of people who knew how to ask questions that ruined dinner and inspired empires. At the center of it all is Socrates. Not the white-bearded marble bust you're picturing, but a real man, round-faced, plain-looking, barefoot, leaning forward with a glint in his eye that says, "I'm about to ruin your entire belief system." And he starts with silence. Socrates was famous for many things: his method of questioning, his love of paradox, his reluctance to write anything down. But perhaps his most underrated tool was the pause. A long, deliberate, let-you-squirm-in-it pause. His followers noted this often. One even called his silences as sharp as daggers. He would ask a question, then sit back and wait, sometimes for minutes. Historians still argue whether these silences were strategic or simply part of his personality. Maybe he was a slow thinker. Maybe he liked watching people sweat. But most agree they were effective. The longer he waited, the more truth people blurted out. You watch as he turns to a younger man, a student maybe, or a guest like you. Socrates asks him what justice means. The boy stammers, begins to speak, then stops. He tries again, still uncertain. Socrates remains silent. That silence stretches. It fills the space between their eyes. It dares the student to earn the right to speak. Eventually, he gives an answer. It's not perfect, but it's his. This, you realize, is hesychia again, but applied to conversation. It's not just about withholding speech. It's about creating space. Socrates knew that silence made people think harder, that without it, answers were just noise. And sometimes, he didn't answer at all. There's a famous exchange in Plato's Symposium where Socrates is directly questioned about love. He says nothing, just stares into the fire. And his silence becomes an answer in itself, a challenge. Say what you want, it tells them. I'll listen. I might even agree. But I don't owe you an interruption. Another fun tidbit. Diogenes, the wild-haired cynic who once lived in a barrel and trolled Plato for fun, once stood silently in the middle of a marketplace holding a lamp in broad daylight. When asked what he was doing, he said, "I am looking for an honest man." But for a long time before he said that, he said nothing. He just stood there, silently judging. Philosophy in ancient Greece wasn't just about what you said. It was about what you refused to say. Silence became a kind of philosophical punctuation, a pause that made the thought sharper. You reach for a cup of watered wine, lifting it to your lips as the men around the table debate fate, courage, and the soul. Every now and then, one of them trails off, not because he's done, but because he knows he needs silence to think. And no one interrupts him. Imagine that. A dinner party where nobody tries to one-up each other, where no one fills every pause with a joke or a story about their cousin. Just respect, reflection, the quiet between ideas. Of course, not every philosopher treated silence the same way. Plato wrote it into his dialogues, clearly valuing it. But Aristotle? He preferred clarity, speech, definition. He wanted everything named, organized, sorted. Silence to him was a little too slippery. Still, even he admitted that sometimes silence is the only response to the vastness of truth. You lean back now, watching the flicker of oil lamp shadows dance along the courtyard walls. The conversation continues, soft and unhurried. No one pushes. No one performs. They just wonder together. You think of how rare that is now, how most debates today are just noise, people talking over each other, filling every second with opinions, never leaving room for questions to breathe. But here, a pause could be the highlight of the night. There's a stillness in your chest now, not emptiness, just calm. A moment where the mental clutter quiets and something deeper starts to surface. The table falls silent for a moment, and Socrates glances up at the stars. "No man," he says softly, "has wisdom in full." Then he says nothing more, and neither does anyone else. Not because they're bored, but because what else needs to be said. You leave the courtyard quietly, slipping back into the moonlit streets of Athens. The laughter and questions of philosophers fade behind you, replaced by the soft hush of sleeping homes. Lamps burn low behind shuttered windows, and somewhere down a side alley, a cat leaps gracefully across a roof with the silence of a whisper. Now, your steps take you into a residential quarter, a neighborhood of small stone houses clustered close together. You duck under a wooden beam and find yourself in a courtyard bordered by walls tall enough to block the night breeze. It's quiet here, but not like the temple or the theater. This is a domestic silence, and it carries a different weight. A woman sits just inside a doorway, her fingers weaving thread into a small loom. She doesn't see you. Or rather, she sees you but doesn't acknowledge you, because here, your presence isn't supposed to matter. You're invisible in this space. This is a silence shaped by rules, by roles, and by who was allowed to speak. You're in the women's quarters. It surprises many people, but ancient Greece, particularly Athens, wasn't exactly the land of democratic equality it's often portrayed as. Women's voices, quite literally, were limited. In most respectable households, women were expected to remain indoors, speak softly, and certainly not raise their voices in public. Silence was considered virtuous, a sign of good breeding, of moral discipline. One mainstream fact: in classical Athenian society, women weren't permitted to participate in public debate, vote, or represent themselves in court. Their legal existence was mediated entirely through male guardians, and their silence wasn't just custom, it was law. You stand now beneath a pergola heavy with grapevines, and you hear something odd, not silence, but layered quiet. A child's breathing from an upper window, a muffled prayer from the far corner of the courtyard, the slow tap of weaving weights against the loom. It's in this hushed space that generations of women lived entire lifetimes, raising children, mourning husbands, managing households, all while largely unheard. And yet, their silence was not always submission. Sometimes it was survival. Historians still debate how much autonomy Greek women truly had. Some argue that private life allowed for subtle forms of power, economic, emotional, maternal. Others claim that these spaces were prisons of quiet, decorated with olive oil jars and echoed with unspoken frustration. The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. You step softly past a garden pot, and something catches your eye. A small clay figurine tucked into the base of a wall. A woman, seated, her hands folded. No inscriptions, just a face shaped in soft profile, mouth closed. You wonder who made her, and why. There's a fringe belief that such figurines weren't just toys or offerings, but tokens of defiance, silent icons for women whose words couldn't be recorded. Archaeologists have found them buried in thresholds, between walls, and even beneath the beds of newlyweds. Maybe they were prayers. Maybe they were warnings. Maybe they were witnesses. The silence of women in ancient Greece was layered and complex. In tragedies, women did speak, but usually through tears or curses. Think of Antigone, who breaks the silence of the state to bury her brother. Her voice is powerful, but also doomed. Or Medea, whose silence becomes the prelude to unthinkable acts. Greek literature often used female silence as a narrative tool, a warning that something dangerous was brewing beneath the surface. A quiet woman was not necessarily a safe one. She was waiting, listening, gathering strength. You pass under a low arch and find yourself in a kitchen alcove. The hearth is still warm. A pot of herbs simmers low over coals. This is where mothers told bedtime stories, not in words you'd find on scrolls or tablets, but in whispers, in lullabies, in half-remembered myths passed down from grandmother to granddaughter. These stories weren't written, but they endured. In fact, there's evidence that much of Greek oral tradition was preserved by women in domestic spaces. Historians rarely quote them because there's nothing to quote, but the rhythms remain. The same cadences found in early Greek lullabies show up centuries later in monastic chants. Silence as memory, silence as echo. And you realize something strange. This quiet doesn't feel oppressive. It feels full, not full of words, but of presence, of attention, every movement deliberate, every breath a kind of language. In this house, silence isn't the absence of speech. It is the speech, just untranslated. You return to the courtyard, and the woman at the loom finally looks up. She doesn't smile. She doesn't speak. But she nods. A simple gesture. A whole conversation. You nod back, then turn to leave. As you step into the street, you think again of how we often equate silence with powerlessness. But here, in this small house tucked beneath the stars of ancient Athens, silence is something else. It's dignity. It's legacy. It's a voice that knows it doesn't have to raise itself to be heard, at least not in the ways we usually notice. You walk through the sleeping city now, your sandals barely scuffing the worn stones of the street. The night has grown denser. A hush wraps around the buildings like a veil. It's the hour when even the cicadas pause, as if the world itself is catching its breath. You're heading toward the edge of Athens, toward the walls where the city meets the wild. But before you reach them, your path takes you past a small stone building with a narrow doorway and an oil lamp flickering faintly outside. You pause, sensing something different about this place. This is a philosophical school, not the grand halls of Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum, but a humble offshoot, the kind where students sleep on mats and argue about ethics over lentils. Tonight, they sleep. But if you listen carefully, the walls themselves seem to hum with unspoken thought. Here, silence wasn't just a tool or a virtue. It was a discipline. You slip inside. The room is dimly lit, filled with the smell of parchment, lamp oil, and the faint peppery sting of burned sage. Cushions lie scattered in a circle. At the center, a scroll sits open, and next to it, a phrase has been written in charcoal across the stone floor. Let silence be your first lesson. The Stoics, yes, those famously unflappable philosophers, believed silence was essential for training the mind. To speak only when necessary, to respond, not react, to hold one's tongue until emotion had passed and reason could speak clearly. One mainstream fact: the Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught his students to practice epoche, restraint of judgment, by first restraining their tongues. Nature gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, he said, so that we might listen twice as much as we speak. He wasn't being poetic. He was being deadly serious. You find a place on the floor and sit. Even now, centuries later, you can feel it. This room was designed for thought, for tension held not in argument, but in anticipation. Here, debates weren't settled with shouting matches, but with extended pauses. 5 words, a long breath, 3 more. Then stillness, while everyone turned the ideas over in their minds like stones in their hands. Historians still argue whether Stoic silence was practical or mystical. Some claim it was just about emotional self-control. Others say it had religious roots, a way of aligning the self with the logos, the divine rational order of the universe, a kind of quiet worship. You reach toward the scroll. It's in Greek, of course, the letters fluid and clean. A fragment from Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism. Better to trip with the foot than with the tongue. There's a dry joke in there somewhere. You smile, but you also know the truth in it. Words, once spoken, can't be unsaid. The Stoics believed every syllable cost something, not just in social currency, but in inner clarity. Silence, then, was a kind of savings account for wisdom. There's a lesser-known fact about Pythagoras, yes, the triangle guy, that he required new initiates into his school to observe total silence for 5 years. Not a typo. 5. It was called the quinquennial silence, and it was believed to help students learn to listen, to internalize, to observe. Fringe? Absolutely. But strangely compelling. Imagine the kind of attention you'd develop after 5 years of just watching and thinking. You lie back now, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling beams above. A beetle scurries across the floor nearby, its tiny footsteps almost inaudible. The silence in this place is dense, not oppressive, just focused. You remember a modern term, holding space. That's what this silence does. It holds space for reflection, for precision, for the awareness that once you do speak, you'd better mean it. A whisper of wind slips through the window shutter. You watch it move a loose page on the floor. 1 word is written on it. Metriopatheia, measured emotion. The Stoic ideal. And suddenly, it strikes you that Greek silence wasn't just external. It wasn't just about temples and theaters and women's courtyards and battlefields. It was internal, too. an entire philosophy built around the idea that your inner voice should be quiet, not suppressed, just clear, patient, not ruled by panic or passion or pride, but deliberate. You imagine a young student lying just where you are now, staring at the same ceiling, trying to memorize his first rule. Say less. Think more. He probably failed sometimes, lost his temper, blurted something out. But he kept trying. Because the goal wasn't silence for silence's sake. It was clarity. You stand now, stepping carefully over sleeping mats and silent scrolls. At the door, you pause. The phrase painted on the wall catches your eye again. Let silence be your first lesson. You nod to yourself. Maybe your best one, too. You step back into the night, the stone threshold of the school still cool beneath your feet. The silence of the Stoics lingers in your mind like incense, subtle, cerebral, unshakable. But outside, the air has changed. A breeze kicks up from the hills, ruffling the hems of your tunic, carrying with it the faint, rhythmic sound of something more primal. Not drums, not footsteps. A softer kind of presence. You're near a sanctuary again, though not like the one before. This is no grand marble temple, no philosophical school. This is a sacred grove on the city's fringe, sacred to Pan, the wild god of shepherds, flutes, and whispers in the grass. The Greeks didn't only revere silence in polished halls or tidy rituals. They knew there was a kind of silence that lived in the cracks, between branches, under stones, deep in caves. This was the silence of nature, and it held its own power. You walk into the grove, ducking beneath low-hanging branches. The air smells of myrtle and damp bark. Cicadas start up their night chorus again, then pause as if acknowledging your presence. You smile. You're intruding, but politely. A narrow stream cuts through the undergrowth. You crouch beside it, watching moonlight ripple across the surface. In the distance, you hear a flute. Soft, uneven. Not performance. Just someone playing alone. Maybe for Pan. Maybe just to hear the notes. The Greeks believed places like this were alive, not just scenic, sacred. And their silence wasn't emptiness. It was listening. The land itself, they believed, could hear, and sometimes could speak back. One mainstream fact: many Greek oracles operated from remote, natural settings, springs, caves, mountaintops, where silence was treated as a necessary condition for communion with the divine. You didn't just show up and start shouting questions. You entered with reverence, with breath held, with silence as your offering. You rise and follow the sound of that flute. It leads you to a clearing, moon-washed and empty. A ring of stones surrounds a flat patch of earth where herbs have been burned recently, rosemary maybe, or laurel. You stand there, still. No flute now, just your heartbeat. The wind pressing through the canopy like a slow exhale. This is Eremos again, the silence of solitude. But not loneliness. A chosen quiet. One the Greeks sought out when the city's clamor grew too much. You remember something from Heraclitus. Nature loves to hide. He wasn't just being poetic. He meant that truth, deep truth, isn't loud. It's buried. It's whispered. It requires patience, silence even. Historians still debate whether natural sanctuaries like this were truly used for mystical rites, or whether the stories attached to them are mostly symbolic. Either way, the Greeks believed the wild had rules, and those rules often began with, "Don't speak unless invited." There's a story, a bit fringe, that a group of shepherds once danced too loudly near a sacred spring of Artemis. The next day, all of them woke mute. The spring, apparently, had silenced them. It's probably myth, but it tells you what mattered. The gods listened, and if you didn't respect their silences, they took your own. You find a smooth stone and sit. There's moss beneath you, soft and cool. You let your eyes close. The rustling of leaves becomes waves. The creak of trees becomes breath. The hum of insects becomes a kind of chorus. And then, for a moment, all of it fades. Pure silence. The kind that doesn't feel like absence, but attention. And you wonder, how often did the ancient Greeks come here not for worship, but for relief? From politics, from family, from themselves. Maybe they didn't call it meditation, but it was. A practice of retreat, of reset. There's a lesser-known term, sigitarios topos, place of silence. Used in some texts to describe spots not defined by architecture, but by atmosphere. A bend in the river, a hollow in a cliff, a patch of reeds where birds won't sing. You're sitting in one now. You reach into the soil beside you, sifting a little in your fingers. It's rich, dark, alive. There's something humbling about knowing that even here, so far from the agora, from the shouts of the city, you're still in the Greek world, a world that made space for silence in every corner, even in its mythology. You remember that in the story of Echo and Narcissus, it's not just vanity that destroys him. It's soundlessness. Echo, cursed to repeat others' words, fades into nothing. And Narcissus, obsessed with his reflection, never hears her, because she cannot speak first. Their tragedy is told in silence, and it lingers. The moon is high now. The clearing is soaked in silver. You close your eyes again, and you feel it. Not loneliness, not emptiness. Stillness, presence. The kind the Greeks understood without needing to name. You rise slowly from the grove, brushing soft moss from your palms. The silence of Pan's clearing follows you like perfume, subtle, clinging to your skin, altering your pace. You walk more carefully now, the rhythm of your footsteps gentler, less like a visitor, and more like a guest who's decided to stay a little longer. You take the long way back into the city, through the outskirts, past low garden walls and fig trees shaped like huddled figures in the moonlight. The streets are empty. No carts, no chatter, just stone and shadow. Athens sleeps, but not entirely. Your path takes you toward a squat building near the foot of the Acropolis. At first glance, it's unremarkable. Plain facade, small windows, a door that creaks without complaint. But inside, there's a quiet movement. Figures swaying, a soft scrape of sandals on stone. a single flickering lamp. You've stumbled into an initiation ritual, one not advertised on city walls, one not sung about at symposiums. These rites live on the margins, carried in hushed voices and secret silences. You stay near the doorway, barely breathing. At the center of the room stands a woman in a white himation, her arms lifted, her face calm but stern. Around her, initiates kneel with heads bowed. No one speaks, not because they're afraid, but because they know the silence matters more than any words they might say. This is Mysterian, the mystery cult's silence, sacred, secret, and not to be broken. One mainstream historical fact: the Eleusinian mysteries, the most famous of these cults, demanded absolute silence from initiates, not only during the ceremonies, but afterward, for life. The punishment for revealing the rites was death, not metaphorically, actually death. The Roman Cicero called the mysteries the greatest gift Athens gave the world, and yet he, too, refused to describe them. Historians still argue what actually happened in those rites. Some believe it involved reenactments of Demeter and Persephone's reunion. Others suspect the use of psychoactive substances. But no one knows, because no one talked. Thousands of initiates over centuries, and not a single detailed leak. That's the power of a cultural silence. You watch now as the high priestess raises a small vessel of grain and pours it onto the ground. The rustle of kernels is the loudest sound in the room. Then, nothing. Everyone waits. And you realize, again, that silence isn't the absence of ritual. It is the ritual. There's a fringe theory that the Eleusinian silence wasn't just about secrecy, but about cognitive preparation. That the quiet forced initiates into a state of mental clarity, almost like a sensory fast. That what they experienced wasn't meant to be narrated, but to be felt in the bones. You step back into the shadows, watching from the safety of darkness. This kind of silence feels heavier than others you've walked through tonight. Not peaceful, not philosophical, charged, like standing under storm clouds that never break. The Greeks had a word for this kind of quiet, too. Aporetos, what is forbidden to speak. It was not just religious. It extended into politics, medicine, even family. There were truths too sacred, too dangerous, too complicated to voice. You pass a young initiate on your way out. Her eyes are closed, lips moving in a soundless prayer. You wonder what truths she's been given tonight, and what weight that silence now carries. As you leave, your mind turns to modern secrets, to all the things we keep inside, not because we're hiding, but because words would shrink them, reduce them, make them manageable. But some things aren't meant to be manageable. Some things are only meant to be carried. You walk again, the Acropolis rising above you, its white marble softened by moonlight and time. The Parthenon glows faintly in the distance. It, too, has known silence. The hush of worshippers, the stunned stillness of visitors, the eerie quiet after war and fire. You remember something Herodotus once wrote? That when the Persians sacked the Acropolis, survivors didn't speak of it for years. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. Out of refusal to reduce trauma to chatter. Even tragedy has its silences. And perhaps the most sacred ones come not from temples or schools or groves, but from within. The ones you choose to hold. You pass a sleeping dog curled by a column base. Its breath rises and falls slowly. It doesn't stir as you pass. It trusts the night. You pause, one last time, beneath the gaze of Athena's statue, barely visible in the shadows. No torchlight, no tourists, no offerings tonight. Just you. And a city whose silences have lasted longer than its wars, longer than its walls, longer than its names. You descend from the Acropolis slowly now, not because your legs are tired, though they are, but because something inside you wants to prolong the silence just a little longer. You've crossed temples, theaters, battlefields, groves and hearths, and still the quiet persists. It's not empty. It's generous, patient. A silence that seems to say, "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. The streets are wider here. You've reached the outskirts of the city proper, where the houses thin and the land stretches open toward the port. The air smells faintly of brine. Far off, the sea grumbles against the shore, low, steady, like a giant's breathing. You follow it. Soon, you come upon a gathering of people along the rocks. Not a crowd exactly, just a small cluster of figures in cloaks, seated in a semicircle facing the dark water. No one speaks. You recognize this scene. You found a mourning ritual. No wailing, no chest beating. Not here. This is Siga and time, silence in honor. A cultural practice among the Greeks that framed grief not only as expression, but as containment. The deeper the love, the quieter the grief. You sit at a respectful distance, the sea wind tugging gently at your sleeves. At the center of the semicircle is a small altar, a stone with a laurel wreath, a bit of oil poured over it, glistening in the moonlight. No names, no speeches, just presence. One mainstream fact. In many Greek funerary traditions, especially among the elite, public displays of mourning were highly regulated. Laws restricted how loudly or dramatically one could weep during funerals, especially women. Excessive noise was seen as disruptive, even disrespectful to the dead. Proper grief was measured in silence and ritual. Historians still argue whether these restrictions came from genuine reverence or a desire for social control. Were the Greeks trying to elevate grief into something dignified, or just suppressing the messiness of loss? As always, the answer's probably both. But here, now, in this soft gathering of the grieving, the silence feels sincere. You notice someone lighting a small clay lamp and setting it afloat on the water. Others follow suit. Tiny flames drift into the night, bobbing with the tide. No one says a word. The silence does all the speaking. It reminds you of something, the idea that when words fail, ritual carries us. And the Greeks understood that deeply. There's a fringe detail about a funerary tradition from Thessaly, where family members would place small lead tablets inscribed with nothing, blank, inside graves. Scholars debate their meaning. Were they protective charms? Symbolic silence? A way to say, there are no words? Whatever they were, Those blank tablets remain a kind of mystery, a silence that endures even in stone. You watch the sea for a long time. Waves lap softly against the shore, covering and uncovering pebbles. The sound repeats like a lullaby, unhurried and uncaring whether anyone is listening. It just goes on. You realize that's what silence often is, something that goes on without you. It doesn't ask for attention. It just is. The mourners begin to rise one by one, cloaks wrapped tightly, feet careful on the damp rocks. No one turns to speak. No one embraces. They simply understand that tonight was enough, that silence had said what needed to be said. You rise too, brushing sand from your hands, and glance once more at the flickering lights on the water. And maybe, you think, that's the most profound silence of all, the one between the living and the dead. Not fearful, not cold, just respectful. A promise to remember without disturbing. You walk on, now hugging the coast, the sea always at your side like a sleepy friend. In the distance, a fishing boat creaks in its moorings. A dog barks once, then sighs. The Greeks had words for this silence too. Galeen, the calm after storm, not just in weather, but in heart. You let that word settle in you. Galeen. And for the first time tonight, you notice the silence inside yourself. It's been growing, hasn't it? Quietly, like a garden, a softening of your internal monologue, a retreat from noise, the chittering thoughts, the buzzing opinions, the relentless narration of modern life, all quieter now. Because for the past few hours, you've been speaking the language of the Greeks, and that language, beneath all its poetry and philosophy, has one shared grammar: silence. You follow the coastline back inland now, not toward the temples or the agora, but to a hill overlooking the city. A quiet perch where shepherds used to rest and lovers once met under the stars. The grass is dry, the stones warm from the day's heat. You climb slowly, your footsteps soft, the wind tugging lazily at your sleeves. At the top, the whole of Athens unfolds beneath you. Rooftops stacked like sleeping books, alleyways like veins, the glowing crown of the Acropolis in the distance. The sea glimmers just beyond, and for a moment, you don't move. You simply stand there, letting the wind wash over you, your breath slow and even. This is not a place of speech. It never was. It's a place for looking, for thinking, for not thinking. A hill with no name, but filled with memory. And here, high above the city, you sense all the silences you've passed tonight gathering into one long, continuous hush, like threads converging in a single weave. Each kind of quiet now layered on top of the other. The reverent silence of the temple, the strategic silence of the battlefield, the charged silence of the theater, the patient silence of the philosopher, the enduring silence of the household, the intentional silence of the stoic, the sacred silence of the mystic, the mourning silence of the shoreline, and finally, this one, the content silence of solitude, a quiet not filled with thoughts or prayers or rituals, just being, just you here, now. You lie down in the grass, arms behind your head, and stare at the stars. The constellations haven't changed much since the Greeks mapped them. Orion still hunts, Cassiopeia still lounges, and between them, infinite blackness, infinite quiet. One mainstream fact: ancient Greek astronomers often conducted their observations in complete silence, believing that speech could disrupt the harmony of the celestial order. To name the stars aloud before understanding them was seen as reckless, a kind of arrogance. Better to watch and wait and listen. Historians still argue whether this belief was widespread or localized to specific cults and schools. But what's certain is that stargazing wasn't casual. It was devotional. It was quiet. There's a story, possibly a footnote, possibly a myth, that Ptolemy once spent 3 nights on a rooftop in Alexandria without speaking a single word, just tracing Venus across the sky with a charcoal stick and a heartbeat steady as a metronome. No calculations, no announcements, just alignment, observation as prayer. You watch the sky now, and it returns the favor. No answers, no riddles, just sky. And for the first time, you understand why the Greeks had so many words for silence. It wasn't just poetry. It wasn't just culture. It was recognition. That silence isn't a monolith. It has shades, flavors, textures. It can be loving, tense, profound, dangerous, tragic, divine, human. You think again of those words. Sige, simple silence, no speech. Hesychia, inner calm, meditative stillness. Eremos, solitude, desolation. Apophasis, silence as a way of knowing what cannot be said. Galeen, the hush after the storm, the peace that arrives. Each one a little different. Each one describing not just what's absent, but what is present. And maybe that's the whole point. That silence, to the Greeks, was never really about nothingness. It was about attention, to the gods, to the self, to the world, to grief, to joy, to meaning. You close your eyes now, not to escape, but to listen more deeply. To the grass bending under your back, to the wind threading through the olive branches, to the thrum of your own breath, slow and anchored, to the world, not demanding, but inviting you to be quiet with it. And in that final moment, high on this hill above Athens, with the city asleep and the stars awake, you finally understand what the Greeks knew all along, that silence is not the absence of life. It is the moment when life becomes still enough for you to truly hear it. And now, with the journey complete, you feel the weight of the night settle gently over your shoulders. Not heavy, just full, like a well-woven blanket, like the pause at the end of a sentence that doesn't need a next one. You're still lying there on the hill. The city stretches out below like a softly breathing body. The stars continue their quiet watch. Nothing has changed. And yet, everything feels quieter. Inside you, too, something has slowed. Your thoughts no longer trip over each other. Your breath moves like a tide, In, out, pause. In, out, pause. No need to name it. No need to explain it. All the Greek words for silence still hover in your memory, but you don't reach for any of them now. Not because they're gone, but because silence has become something simpler. It has become yours. So let the day fade behind you. Let the distant city dim. Let the wind tell the story now, the one without language. Let your muscles sink a little deeper into rest. Let your face soften. Let your mind, so full, so bright, begin to blink more slowly. And in this final hush, with all the ancient quiet still echoing in your ears, know this: you are allowed to rest. You are allowed to not speak. You are allowed to listen to nothing and to find everything in it. Sleep well, traveler, and may your dreams speak in the softest possible voice.